week 12 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few players I look to sell and trade with some fantasy deadlines up and some coming up in the next week or two. It's crunch time to go out there and make the trades. So the first sells Calvin Ridley of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Ridley finally had the breakout game after the most part this season. He really hasn't done much as Calvin Ridley. So the last few games before the breakout, week 7 at New Orleans, a catch 5 yards. Week 8 at Pittsburgh, 6 catches, 83 yards. Week 10 versus San Francisco, 2 catches, 20 yards. But then week 11 versus Tennessee, he went off 7 catches, 103 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, and 18 rushing yards. So right now, I know he's got a decent matchup coming up at Houston. But Calvin Ridley really isn't the number one option in this offense. He's third or fourth, in my opinion, in the pecking order, is Calvin Ridley. It starts with Travis Etienne in that offense, Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, and then I think Ridley. So after this season, he was a third, fourth round pick in fantasy drafts. Is Calvin Ridley. He finally had a breakout game, and this is a perfect time to sell him off because he's been too consistent. He was a talented wide receiver and a top 10 wide receiver for a few seasons in fantasy football with the Atlanta Falcons. But right now, this is more of a run-first team for the majority of the season. Is this Jacksonville Jaguar team. So coming off a monster performance, over 30 fantasy points in PPR leagues. He's a perfect sell-high player this week. The next player, DeAndre Hopkins of the Tennessee Titans. It's been a tough first season for Hopkins with this Tennessee Titan team, and it's been a problem all year at the quarterback position. I know Will Levis has a big arm, but it's still been tough for him to connect with Hopkins. Besides that first game in Week 8 where he started, where he had 128 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. So the last few weeks here for Hopkins, Week 9 at Pittsburgh, 4 catches, 60 yards. Week 10 at Tampa, 3 catches, 27 yards. And Week 11 at Jacksonville, 4 catches, 59 yards. And a touchdown. But right now, Hopkins, he really hasn't done much, like I said, this season. You thought he would go to a team where they had better quarterback going into the year, but obviously money was a big thing for Hopkins, and the Titans paid up and gave him a good contract. So right now, after coming off a good game and finding the end zone, and for the most part, he's a touchdown-dependent wide receiver. I would sell Hopkins high this week, especially in an inconsistent offense with a bad offensive line. Next play is Jaylen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers. I know Warren, he's the starting running back, Mike Tomlin and this Pittsburgh Steelers team announced last week, but still, Najee Harris had more carries and pretty much 50-50 in terms of total touches. So Jaylen Warren, he launched the game, no doubt about it, but 9 carries, 129 yards, led by a 75-yard touchdown. Pretty much made his day with 3 catches and 16 yards in that game at the Cleveland Browns. So Jaylen Warren, I know he's an explosive back. I know he's got home run ability like we saw in that game in Week 11, but obviously it's not going to be each and every week where he's only getting 10, 12 touches and he's putting up a big fantasy performance like he did with 23.5 fantasy points. So right now, after coming off the big game, and many people think he's going to run away with this job, even though Najee Harris is still in there 50-50 split. He's a perfect sell-high candidate, and there's always teams looking for running backs. Obviously, each and every week player I look to trade and sell is Devin Singletary of the Houston Texans. I know Damian Pierce has been out the last few weeks, but even with Pierce back, I think it's Singletary's job now for this Texan team with 2 ball games in a row over 100 rushing yards, and they were good matchups. He obviously took advantage of Week 10 at Cincy, a monster workload, 30 carries, 150 rush yards, a touchdown, a catch 11 yards. In Week 11 versus Arizona, one of the weakest D's in the league, 22 carries, 112 yards, and a touchdown, 2 catches, 6 yards. So it's nice to see Singletary get a big workload. But like I said, Pierce isn't going to take the job from him, but obviously those touches are going to go from 25 to 30 touches per game down to possibly 15, 20 touches a game, I believe, with Pierce back in the lineup. So right now, coming off for 2 monster games with 15-plus fantasy points, he is Devin Singletary. He's a perfect sell-high candidate. We've seen it throughout his career where he'll have some pop games like he's had over the last 2 weeks, and then he'll go back to putting up mid-numbers, 7-10 fantasy points. So right now, coming off possibly the 2 best games he's had in years is Devin Singletary. He's a sell-high player this week. Next play is Gus Edwards. Baltimore Ravens, Gus Edwards, he's been a touchdown machine this season, no doubt about it. 10 rushing touchdowns already, and we're only in Week 12, so pretty much every game, on average, he's found the end zone is Gus Edwards. But the last 3 weeks, he's found the end zone 6 times, and I don't see the number keeping up, especially at the goal line. They've been stopped a lot. Is this Baltimore team where he's getting 1 or 2 yard stampers. So Lamar Jackson is playing good football. This Raven team are definitely a Super Bowl favorite, but these numbers for Gus Edwards if he's not getting a touchdown, he's pretty much putting up 5-6 fantasy points. And I think the touchdown ability is going to wear off a little bit over the next few weeks. Week 9 versus Seattle, 5 carries, 52 yards, 2 touchdowns. Week 10 versus Cleveland, 11 carries, 24 yards, a touch, a catch, 4 yards. And Week 11 versus Cincinnati, once again, 12 touches, 62 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 catches, 8 yards. So right now he's been a touchdown playmaker. He's Gus Edwards, no doubt about it. He's got a good matchup Week 12 at the Chargers. And then he goes on bye week and has tougher matchups coming up after that. So right now, with a bye week coming up, and pretty much if he's not scoring a touchdown, he's getting 7 or 8 fantasy points. I would sell Gus Edwards off this week and sell Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Lawrence, the best game of the season, hands down for him versus a weak Tennessee Titan defense in the Week 11 blowout victory where he had 36 fantasy points, 262 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, 17 rush yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns. So we know every week he's not going to get rushing touchdowns. Is Trevor Lawrence. I know he's a decent quarterback running the football over the last couple seasons to start his career as Lawrence, but pretty much he was maxing out 18-20 fantasy points all season. So he finally had that pop game in Week 11, but the next few weeks the matchups are a little bit tougher versus stingier defenses where we know the Titans are a defense that really hasn't stopped anyone this season. So right now, after a lot of weeks in a row with mid-performances and bad weeks for Trevor Lawrence, after coming off a monster ball game, he's a perfect sell-high candidate this week. And the final play I look to sell and trade is Brock Purdy of the San Francisco 49ers. Brock Purdy, he's been an up-and-down quarterback this season. This San Francisco team, even as a whole, 5-0 they started, then lost 3 in a row, and now the last 2, they've been back on track and playing well, and it's led by Brock Purdy, no doubt about it. Week 10 at Jacksonville, 296 pass yards, 3 passing touchdowns. And Week 11 versus Tampa Bay, 333 pass yards and 3 touchdowns. So right now he's definitely taking advantage of good matchups where Week 10 at Jacksonville, they gave up the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. And Week 11 versus Tampa, the 8th most. So right now, quick turnaround, Thanksgiving night, Thursday night game at the Seattle Seahawks. When we know their defense is a pesky defense and they got some ball hawks and playmakers. So right now with the next few weeks, tougher schedule for Brock Purdy. Playing Seattle twice in 3 weeks and the Philly D, even though I know their defense hasn't been all that great this year as Philly versus the pass. I think Brock Purdy's numbers are going to come back down to earth and he's a sell-high player this week. So that's a few plays I look to sell and trade for Week 12 of the fantasy football season.